harder to kill than a vampire. That is what the sociologist Joel Best calls a false statistic that has gone viral. But as I have discovered over the years, among false statistics, the hardest to kill of all are those surrounding the crime of domestic violence. One of the most famous statistical myths was just mentioned by Phyllis, the claim that violence against women, that Super Bowl Sunday is the day of the most severe violence against women. In fact, it was very specific. They said it increases 40%. And in the 1990s, this statistic was pervasive, ubiquitous. It all started with a young activist at she was simply speaking at a news conference, and she mentioned that violence against women increases 40% on Super Bowl Sunday. She had misread a study, and somehow it caught on, it entered the media echo chamber, and was there to remain ever since. Reporters were soon talking about the Super Bowl as the Abuse Bowl. That was actually Robert Lipsyte at the New York Times. The Day of Dread. NBC ran a public service announcement during the Super Bowl Classic, 1993, urging men to remain calm during the game. In this roiling sea of media credulity, one lone journalist, Ken Ringle, decided to check the facts. He was just interested because he thought during Redskins games the city got very quiet, and he was interested, how could there be this outburst of violence? And long story short, he found out there was no source. It was the original urban legend. By the way, there was a major study in 2007 by two University of Alabama researchers. They looked at more than 2,000 crisis call records over a 3-year period. They interviewed abused women. They interviewed staff at shelters. Their conclusion, quote, the widely held belief that women seek shelter during drinking holidays such as New Year's and Super Bowl was unsubstantiated. But remember, Professor Best said that it was harder to kill than a vampire. So if you think the false statistic about the Super Bowl was defeated by the wooden stake of truth, you would be mistaken. The myth was mostly dormant following the 90s, but it came back with a vengeance last summer, although it had jumped a continent and acquired a new accent. During the World Cup 2010, British newspapers carried stories about World Cup abuse nightmare, informing women that the games would uncover for the first time the darker side of your partner. This one was carried out by domestic violence activists, not so much by feminists, but by domestic violence activists in the British Home Office. And it found that research shows that cases of domestic abuse increased by 30% on World Cup days. Determined to stem the tide of violence, they had a campaign with posters in pubs that said, don't let the World Cup leave its mark on you, and then they showed women's battered bodies with bruises and cuts and even the imprint of a man's shoe. Well, fortunately, the BBC had a program called Law in Action, and its producers took the unusual route pioneered by the Washington Post reporter Ken Ringle, and they checked the facts. And on June 22nd of last year, they, about 12 days into the World Cup, they aired a story concluding that it was a stunt based on cherry-picked findings. A telltale sign that something was amiss, the Home Office reported that, quote, domestic violence, that 1 in 4 women in the United Kingdom is a victim of domestic violence. But the Law and Action Program noticed that part of their definition of domestic violence included not only physical and sexual abuse, but emotional and financial misbehavior. Now, it's true that the literature on domestic violence is vast and complex. Sorry, I'm talking. And there are bound to be some mistakes, and I can imagine someone saying, oh, well, there she goes again, just citing some errors. Everybody makes errors. Well, what I have found, and other researchers, is we're not talking about a few errors. We're not talking about occasional lapses. We are talking about a body of egregiously false information at the heart of the domestic violence movement. False claims are pervasive. False claims are not the exception, they're the rule. Now, I don't have time to go through the long, sorry, twisted story about all the misinformation, excuse the pun, but just a couple of examples. Consider this passage. It opens the leading textbook on domestic violence. It's called Domestic Violence Law, Thompson Press. It's used in law schools around the country. Law schools. Not even undergraduates are given this information. It's law students. Quote, the history of women's abuse began 2,700 years ago in the year 753 BC. It was during the reign of Romulus of Rome that wife abuse was accepted and condoned under the laws of chastisement. The laws permitted a man to beat his wife with a rod or switch so long as the circumference was no greater than the girth of the base of the man's right thumb. The law became known as the rule of thumb. These laws established a tradition which was perpetuated in English common law in most of Europe. Now, where to begin with this paragraph? How about the fact that Romulus of Rome never existed? He is a figure in Roman mythology, nursed by son of Mars and nursed by a wolf. And then he killed his brother and so forth. And Rome was founded. It's so absurd. It's sad. Point two, the phrase rule of thumb did not originate with the law of wife beating. Just go to the OED or just type in rule of thumb urban legends. And even feminist professors, law professors admit there's no such law. It's just one of these things, that urban legends again. If you read further on in the classic textbook in law schools, a few pages later it says, and students read this, according to the March of Dimes, men beating their pregnant wives or girlfriends is a leading cause of birth defects. Oh, and also this hardy perennial. Between 20 and 35% of women seeking medical care in emergency rooms are there because of domestic violence. For the record, there is no March of Dimes studies. I called up Richard Levitt, who's the director of science information of the March of Dimes, and he gets very upset. He says, this is a total error on the part of that author. There was no such study. He told me this myth has been around for years. They can't correct it. It's out there. It cannot be withdrawn, even though it's false. The fact that it's false seems to be no reason. That doesn't discredit it in the minds of many people. He explained that it started in the 90s and, as I said, can't be stopped. What about this one, the emergency rooms? I have never read, maybe this is an overstatement, but I don't think so. I've never seen a feminist women's studies textbook that didn't have some version of this statistic. 20 to 30% of women in emergency rooms are there because they were intimate violence. Well, I won't go into all the refutations, but just one is useful. I wrote to the Centers for Disease Control recently to check it out again. And I got a note from Janie Hsiau, and she wrote me that among ED visits made by females, the percent having physical abuse by spouse or partner is 0.02% in 2003, 0.01 in 2005. It's quite a difference. Well, I won't even go into what happened, but anyway, the Penguin Atlas for Women is a leading atlas, Penguin Press, edited by feminist scholar Joni Seeger. It's now in its 4th edition, and it was called a reference book of the year by the American Library Association. When it first appeared, no one should be without this book, said feminist icon Gloria Steinem. A wealth of fascinating information, said the Washington Post. Fascinating, perhaps, but the information is false, much of it, not all of it, but most of it to do with domestic violence. And I just want to mention that they have one color-coded map in this atlas, which is used in classrooms all across the country. And on this map, it shows how women are, this isn't about domestic violence, but it's very revealing. It shows how women are kept in their place by restrictions of mobility, dress, and behavior. Now, somehow, the United States, in this atlas, comes out looking as bad in terms of women's freedom and, being kept in their place. We look as bad as Somalia, Uganda, Yemen, Niger, and Libya. All are coded with the same shade of a kind of depressing green to indicate a place where patriarchal assumptions operate in, quote, a potent combination with fundamentalist religious interpretations. They're talking about the U.S. Her logic, the editor's logic, she notes that in parts of Uganda, a man can claim an unmarried woman his wife by raping her. The United States gets the same low rating because, she says, state legislatures have enacted 301 anti-abortion measures between 1995 and 2001. Now, never mind that the Uganda practice is barbaric and that U.S. abortion law is, in fact, exceptionally liberal among all nations of the world, maybe the most liberal, and that the activism, what's going on in those state houses, is just the sign of a vigorous democracy working out disagreements. On another map, the United States gets the same rating for domestic violence as Uganda and Haiti, and how does she back it up? She pulls out the emergency room factoid. This, she says, 22 to 35% of women who seek emergency medical assistance at hospitals are there because of domestic violence. Now, again, all books have mistakes. People will say, why just pick on the feminists? Because these mistakes are never, I don't want to say never, but almost never corrected. And they're impervious to criticism. And if you point them out to the author, which I did, I wrote to Nancy Lemon, the Berkeley scholar who wrote the textbook on domestic violence, and she just dismissed me as a crank, and the book went into a 4th edition without any corrections. She put Romulus back in the book. I don't know how that happened. It's so bizarre. But anyway, the authors are passionately committed to these statistics because it's their worldview that American society is a patriarchal, oppressive society, and they're desperate to find the smoking gun that proves that they're right. And so they're very uncritical. And then they dismiss anybody who says that they're wrong as a crank or a backlasher. I'm just a philosophy professor who was taught that it matters that you get your arguments are sound, your premises are true. Now why? It was actually during the story about the World Cup. I remember there was an assistant deputy of Gwent who was interviewed about, and the BBC showed her that her information was false. And she replied something like this: I don't care if it's false. Even if it saved lives, it's worth it. I say that it's not worth it. If newspapers and textbooks and atlases are giving us false information, I believe that it's harmful to women. I think women who are victims of domestic violence need truth, accuracy, good research, not hype, not hysteria, not hyperbole. And by the way, it's not limited to textbooks, and these myths find their way into government. If you go to the Justice Department website, I don't think they've taken it down, even though I pointed it out, but Eric Holder didn't care or didn't read it, I'm sure. He says, Eric Holder in a speech said, the facts are clear. Intimate partner violence is the leading cause of death of African American women 15 to 45. In the old days, the feminists would say it was the leading cause of death of all women. Now he's moved it to African American women. It's all false. It's a horrifying statistic, but it's not true. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the leading cause of death for African American women is pretty much, in that age group, is what it is for most women: heart disease, unintentional injuries like car accidents. Homicide is well down the list of causes. Now, every death of an African American woman from intimate violence is a horrifying tragedy, but it's vastly fewer than what Eric Holder said. I just don't know how these women are helped by this kind of outrageous exaggeration. But as I said, they went to this deputy chief constable from the town of Gwent, and she said, if it has saved lives, it's worth it. 3 quick reasons why it's not worth it. First of all, as I said, misinformation is going to lead to bad policies. As I said, that women need good information. Worse, if you promulgate these false statistics, as the women's groups have been doing for years, I think that it leads to prejudice. I think it leads, and I was kind of a feminist in the early 70s because I didn't like male bullies. I still don't like misogyny when I see it. But I don't see that much of it anymore. I see misandry in the culture at large. And of course, there's misogyny in little pockets of troglodytes out there. But misandry is widespread. I see it everywhere. And I think that it's been fed by these, I can only call them hate statistics, these false manufactured statistics that implicate the average guy in a social atrocity. I mean, what's more average than a man sitting watching the Super Bowl and somehow they cast suspicion over all men? And by the way, if you want the truth about domestic violence, and Phyllis already mentioned this, it's a very serious problem for a small percentage of American women. It happens at the same levels in gay couples as it does heterosexual. It's a pathology of intimacy, not patriarchy, not in this society. There are societies where it's a manifestation of patriarchal oppression, not here. And policemen will tell you they go to the same houses weekend after they call them the Saturday night brawlers, and women and men go after each other. She throws something. Well, there are many different types of domestic violence, but it's not what the women's groups say. And again, I could just question how this is going to help. So it leads to bad policy. It leads to mean-spiritedness towards men. Just one example to think about what happened to those young men. It's an extreme example, but it's representative. It's emblematic of the misandry in the land. Those young men at Duke University who were falsely accused of rape, and they were put through a modern-day witch hunt. And I remember this young man, because I had sons that age at the time. They were suffering in this way, and I remember the father of the boy, when Nifong, this rogue prosecutor, read the charges. We're going to indict you for rape. The father collapsed. And I can see us, we think of girls as so fragile, but boys also, to be subject to that kind. And the campus was so cruel and indifferent. And 80 professors, I will never forget, they signed a kind of a petition and published it in the school newspaper, basically calling the boys guilty. So there's that mean-spiritedness. And finally, and this is very, very different direction, but I think it's worth pondering, and I'll end with this. Worst of all, I think the misinformation implicates our society. American society, British society, we're far from perfect. But long ago we decided that brutality against women will not be tolerated. It's been against the law. By contrast, there are places in the world where women are not protected. In the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, it's legal to bury an adulterous woman up to her neck and stone her. But last year they were granted a seat at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And there was a lot of protest, and the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, defended the decision, noting that Iranian women are actually better off than women in most parts of the world. He said, what is left of women's dignity in the West? And he then came up with a statistic to drive home his point. He said, in Europe, almost 70% of housewives are beaten by their husbands. Maybe he got it from the Penguin Atlas of the world. Now, that was a self-serving untruth. I don't know where he got it. But Western women, with few exceptions, are safe and free. Iranian women are not. Officials like Attorney General Holder, the Deputy Constable of Gwent, the activists and journalists who promulgated the Super Bowl hoax, the people who write these atlases, these textbooks, they unwittingly contribute to this twisted deception. So I'm going to end by suggesting the following rule of thumb. Victims of intimate violence are best served by truth. And one other item, I think Eric Holder should correct his department's website immediately. Thank you.